It was early one cold Thursday morning. To us, the setting was simple as usual. Our anti tank gun had been dug in the night previous, camouflaged with pine branches very carefully, and held a round of armor piercing ammunition in the chamber. We waited very patiently with a shell in our gun and the safeties on our rifles, pistols, and carbines pulled. It was as dark as black can be. Daylight hadn't commenced to break when a Jerry machine gun spit out several hundred rounds to our immediate front. Several minutes of silence were followed by a second burst, mixed in with the chatter of German small arms fire. The enemy infantry was getting closer, but on our lines, all fire was held. Our thoughts were glued on the firing we heard, not on any tanks or any other armor, but we knew just when to open fire. Corporal Irvin Schwartz, describing preparations before combat during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Public History with Jake and Justin. I'm Jake Wynn. This week marks the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, the largest battle in American history. On December 16, 1944, Nazi forces launched a massive attack on American troops in the Ardennes Forest in Belgium. This was Hitler's last major counteroffensive of the Second World War. In the early morning hours of that day, more than 200,000 German soldiers, supported by 400 tanks and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, plunged into U.S. Army lines along a weakly held front in the tangled forest, hills, valleys, and villages of eastern Belgium. German forces raced forward to capture bridges on the River Meuse in an effort to split Allied forces and seize the port city of Antwerp. Their goal was to halt the combined American, British, French, and Soviet invasion of the German homeland. As the Germans surged forward, they created a vast bulge in the Allied lines, giving the battle its infamous name. Allied forces, under the command of Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, were rushed into the bulge and along its edges to thwart the Nazi offensive. Among the soldiers thrown into the fray was a 20-year-old corporal from Pine Grove, Pennsylvania, named Irvin Schwartz. This citizen soldier, a young man who had joined the U.S. Army 18 months earlier after graduating from Pine Grove High School, served with an anti-tank crew in the 26th Infantry Regiment, attached to the famed 1st Division of the U.S. Army, the Big Red One. By December 1944, Schwartz had seen the horrors of Omaha Beach, fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, raced across France, battled street by street through the fortress city of Aachen, and now found himself with his comrades defending a tiny Belgian village on the northern shoulder of the Bulge at a place called Dam Buchenbach. It was there, 5 days into the German offensive on December 21st, 1944, that this 5-foot 8-inch soldier from Pennsylvania's anthracite coal country came face to face with death on a frigid, snow-covered battlefield. It was a day that would forever alter the course of Schwartz's life. In this special episode of Public History with Jake and Justin, we'll explore this story from the Battle of the Bulge, highlighting one soldier's experience in the vastness of a battle that ultimately involved more than 1 million soldiers, left more than 10,000 American troops dead, with thousands more missing, and ultimately doomed Hitler's Germany to defeat just 5 months later. Thanks as always for supporting the podcast. If you've been enjoying these episodes, please rate and review the show and make sure to share with your friends and family. Now for the history. The following story comes from a digital history project I worked on from 2020 to 2021 called Letters from War. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I stumbled upon a remarkable letter written by a soldier from Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, in the days before D-Day in 1944. As I learned more about the young man who wrote the letter, which you can hear in a previous episode of the podcast, I wanted to see if Irvin Schwartz from Pine Grove had written any more letters to his hometown newspaper. He had. The West Schuylkill Press Herald had published more than 50 letters written by Schwartz during his military service from 1943 to 1945. As it turned out, this teenager from Pine Grove was a budding journalist when he graduated from Pine Grove High School and then went off to war with the United States Army. He had been employed as the Press Herald's Pine Grove sports reporter before departing for the service. As he left for war, he became the newspaper's frontline correspondent, writing letters home from training camps in Mississippi, military bases in England, foxholes in France, and war-ravaged cities in Germany. He honed his craft with increasingly polished letters, describing the scenes around him and the experiences of an American soldier in the European Theater of Operations, the ETO. Schwartz wrote about the holidays in wartime England in 1943, dining with liberated French civilians in 1944, and often opined on the Pine Grove High School sports he read about in the Letter from Home newsletter that the Press Herald mailed across the world to military personnel from Western Schuylkill County. But among the 50 letters he sent home from World War II, none was quite like the one Schwartz wrote on January 12, 1945. In it, he described a day of battle, a fight that had occurred 3 weeks earlier, in the days before Christmas 1944, as German panzers attempted to overrun American forces in Belgium. In that one day, December 21st, 1944, Schwartz went from a young American soldier to a hardened combat veteran. Now let's delve into the story of Irvin Schwartz in the Battle of Dom Buchenbach. The early hours of December 21st, 1944 were bitterly cold. This was already the harshest winter Europe had experienced in decades. Temperatures flirted with 0 degrees Fahrenheit, with snow, fog, and heavy cloud cover that rendered the Allied advantage in aircraft meaningless in the increasingly fierce battle in the Ardennes Forest and the surrounding region of Belgium. Corporal Irvin Schwartz and his comrades in the 2nd Squad, 3rd Battalion of the 26th Infantry Regiment's anti-tank company sat in their 3 foxholes, staring into the inky blackness of a Belgian winter morning. Their position was on the side of a hill along a tree line in a farmer's field near the tiny crossroads village of Dom Buchenbach. The village sat astride a vital road between the nearby towns of Beulingen and Buchenbach. Beulingen had been the site of heavy fighting in the preceding days as German forces advanced and overwhelmed American units retreating in the face of a surprise, mechanized Nazi onslaught. When word spread of the German attack on December 16th, the 26th Infantry Regiment was on a reprieve from the front lines after participating in brutal fighting in the German border city of Aachen and in the Ardennes Forest throughout the fall of 1944. They were thrown back into combat in Belgium to support the beleaguered 99th Division, which was facing the brunt of a combined armor and infantry assault from the German 6th Panzer Army. The Germans were desperate to push U.S. forces out of the way on their mission to capture the Meuse River bridges, destroy American supply depots, and ultimately reach the port city of Antwerp. The 26th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel John Seitz, put his subordinate, Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Daniels, in charge of the defense at Dom Buchenbach, a village astride the main east-west road through the region. Daniels placed a mixture of infantry and anti-tank guns in fields surrounding the crossroads village on a ridgeline dotted with farm fields, hedgerows, and tree lines. The regiment faced brutal attacks as soon as it took its place in the line at Dom Buchenbach on December 18th. Tank assaults, accompanied by German infantry, pressed and broke holes in the American line south of the village on December 20th. The situation grew so desperate that an anti-tank gunner named Henry Warner single-handedly faced down 3 German panzers, rolling over his foxhole toward his 57mm anti-tank gun. Warner knocked out 2 tanks with the gun at close range, but it jammed when he loaded a 3rd round into the breech. Instead of running, Warner drew his .45 caliber pistol and fired at the tank's commander, who had emerged from the turret. Warner took aim and struck the German officer in the head, killing him instantly. In the chaos following the loss of its commander and 2 additional tanks ahead, the last German panzer retreated from the American line. On the night of December 20th, just after dusk, Corporal Schwartz and his comrades moved into position along the MLR, the main line of resistance at Dom Buchenbach. They served in the 3rd Platoon of the regiment's anti-tank company and had been held in reserve on December 20th. The 21st would put them squarely on the front line. They set up their guns, disguised them as best they could with pine branches from the surrounding tree line, assisted in digging deeper foxholes alongside comrades in Company E of the 26th Regiment, and tried to bed down to get what sleep they could. It was fitful. German artillery and rockets pounded the village through the early morning hours, making sleep difficult in the oppressive darkness. They waited for the inevitable German assault in the morning. As the men huddled in their foxholes, the hours crept by in tense silence. The freezing air bit through the layers of army-issued clothing, and the weight of the impending battle pressed on them. Time ticked away, measured by the rotation of the guards. Schwartz later recalled, "The watches showed us the time as 4:15 a.m. when Private First Class Ignatius Sakruski of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Private First Class John Howard of Seattle, Washington, finished a 2-hour guard. They were relieved by Corporal Donald Rose of Mount Pleasant, Iowa, and Private First Class William Ryan of Knoxville, Tennessee, who carried our guard up to 6:15. During this period of time, things were quiet, excepting a few mortar shell or artillery bursts. Few fell close to us, but would fail to attract our attention. We were in hotter spots on too many occasions." The tension of waiting weighed on the men, but the relative quiet was a fragile reprieve. They knew it couldn't last. As Schwartz noted, "A few Jerry artillery and mortar shells wasn't all. Thursday was ultimately a big battle day." The calm began to fray before dawn. Schwartz described the moment vividly. "I was on guard no longer than 3/4 of an hour when our very capable platoon leader, Lieutenant Wallace Wyant of Belmore, Long Island, received an order of a special alert. We were notified by our platoon sergeant, Technical Sergeant Glenn Peters of Marionville, Pennsylvania, who was kept exceptionally busy throughout the night, keeping in close contact with the 3 squads in his platoon. In announcing the special alert, Peters stated that German infantry was headed our way. The alert set the squad into motion. Schwartz and his comrades, suddenly on high alert, braced themselves for what was coming. Immediately, our entire squad was awakened. We waited very patiently with a shell in our gun and the safeties on our rifles, pistols, and carbines pulled. It was as dark as black can be." The commander of this gun in 3rd Platoon of the 26th Anti-Tank Company, Staff Sergeant Noah Collier, passed orders to his men as they awaited action. "Load sabot," he said. "Hold your fire until you can get a flank shot at about 20 feet. Sabot rounds were specially designed British ammunition that utilized high-velocity projectiles and anti-tank guns to penetrate the thick steel armor on German tanks. At close range, like what Sergeant Collier predicted was about to happen at Dom Buchenbach, these rounds were incredibly effective against German panzers." As dawn approached, the stillness shattered. Schwartz's description of the moment is chilling in its starkness. "Daylight hadn't commenced to break when a Jerry machine gun spit out several hundred rounds to our immediate front. Several minutes of silence were followed by a second burst, mixed in with the chatter of German small arms fire. The enemy infantry was getting closer, but on our lines, all fire was held. Our thoughts were glued on the firing we heard, not on any tanks or other armor. We knew just when to open fire." This anticipation was unbearable. Each sound and movement in the darkened battlefield felt amplified. The soldiers knew their moment would come soon, and when it did, there would be no room for hesitation. As dawn finally began to creep across the frozen landscape, the moment Schwartz and his squad had been preparing for arrived with ferocious intensity. The German infantry, emboldened by the lack of an immediate response to their probing fire, moved closer. Unaware, they were walking directly into the teeth of a well-prepared American defense. "Evidently, Jerry figured our lines to be further away after not receiving response to his initial fire," Schwartz later recalled. "Eventually, he came within our reach, and machine guns, BARs, mortars, artillery, and everything else in the line of American firing devices greeted the enemy." The battlefield erupted into chaos. What began as sporadic small arms fire quickly escalated into a cacophony of rifles, machine guns, and grenades. Schwartz described it as pure hell. This marked the start of a long, hard battle which stretched well into the late afternoon. It was a period wherein the throwing of a hand grenade would bring back the throwing of a potato masher, one of Jerry's most deadly grenades, and the burst of a carbine or a pistol was answered by a shot from a German rifle. Amid this chaos, Schwartz and his crewmates, including their gun leader, Staff Sergeant Noah Collier, scrambled to keep their anti-tank gun ready. Collier, a steady and determined leader from the mountains of southwestern Virginia, ensured the gun crew remained focused, even as the German onslaught intensified. While our artillery poured into the enemy's area, our mortars and theirs exchanged. It was hell to live in, and such a hell that we never thought of food and rest, but of more ammunition and more trigger squeezes on our small arms, Schwartz wrote. The first wave of infantry was being repulsed, leaving the field littered with German dead. Amid the din of small arms fire, the groans of wounded men, and the explosions of mortar shells and artillery, Schwartz and Collier's gun crew worked to prepare for what they had sensed was coming next. As they fought with German grenadiers, the unmistakable sound of tank treads clanking through the snow-covered earth reached their ears. The attack evidently had been planned very cautiously, and as a result, the Wehrmacht's infantry were well supported by panzers, Schwartz explained. The sound of tanks came very suddenly to our ears, while at the same time we were fighting off enemy infantry forces. The first Mark IV Panzer burst into view, crashing through the tree line just 100 yards in front of their position. Its turret swung menacingly, the barrel pointed directly at their gun emplacement. Behind it, another tank rumbled into view. Collier barked orders as the crew sprang into action. The whole crew rushed to the gun, Schwartz wrote, and after pouring 4 rounds of ammo into the head tank, we saw nothing but a huge block of flames. Its crew never received the slightest opportunity of escaping. In fact, not one of them had known what happened. The second tank soon followed its lead vehicle into oblivion, with American anti-tank gunners and artillery zeroing in on its vulnerable flank. Schwartz and his crew had taken out 2 German tanks at remarkably close range. The engagement was relentless. Even while we fired upon the German armor, we were shot at by Germans not more than 10 yards to our front and to our right flank, Schwartz recalled. The men of the gun crew, including Schwartz, Collier, and Private First Class Donald Rose, alternated between firing the anti-tank gun and defending themselves with rifles, carbines, and grenades. As the battle raged, Collier's courage shone through. Despite the chaos and danger, he maintained control of the gun crew and fought alongside Schwartz, Rose, and others, some of whom had been wounded. Collier wielded a Browning automatic rifle he had picked up from a wounded infantryman and raked the advancing grenadiers with deadly fire, holding the line against wave after wave of German soldiers. Their position, however, was incredibly vulnerable. A well-aimed German Panzerfaust, a bazooka, struck their anti-tank gun, knocking it off its mount and rendering it inoperable. Schwartz and Rose were forced to abandon the gun and shift entirely to small arms, but they continued to fight tenaciously. The lulls between the 4 rounds from our anti-tank gun were occupied by our shooting of our respective small arms rifles, carbines, and pistols, and by the throwing of all available hand grenades, Schwartz noted. Amid this desperate fighting, Sergeant Collier was wounded in the leg, yet he continued to fight, even dashing out into the open to aid a wounded GI. Tragically, Collier disappeared into the fog during this act of heroism and was never seen alive again. His absence was a devastating loss for the crew, though his leadership and sacrifice undoubtedly saved lives that day. The battle raged on, and ultimately Schwartz and his comrades were forced to retreat by continued German assaults. They fell back to the village of Dom Buchenbach, fighting around the 2nd Battalion 26th Infantry Regiment's headquarters in the village's large manor house and outbuilding complex. There, American artillery, tanks, and tank destroyers turned back the tide of the German onslaught and secured victory for the 26th Infantry. They held the line. In the days that followed, U.S. soldiers in the 26th Regiment sector counted more than 780 German corpses and the hulks of 43 destroyed German tanks. The 26th had broken the German advance, and the forces in this sector never reached their objectives. The northern shoulder of the Bulge was secured. The aftermath of the fighting at Dom Buchenbach was anything but peaceful. The fields and forests surrounding the small Belgian village were strewn with the wreckage of war. Burned out tanks, shattered trees, and the lifeless bodies of German and American soldiers alike. For Corporal Irvin Schwartz and his comrades, the days that followed were a blur of bitter cold, exhaustion, and the ever-present specter of death. Reflecting on those grim days in a letter dated January 2nd, 1945, Schwartz wrote to his hometown editor, "There was little peace for soldiers on the Western Front this Christmas Day. Even amid the devastation, the war's brutality was punctuated by surreal, haunting images. Schwartz recalled a scene that stayed with him. On Christmas Eve, the only thing to remind me that another Christmas day had arrived was the blazing interior of a large church just across a narrow field from my foxhole. It was set on fire by the Germans early in the morning of the 24th. The flames Schwartz saw reflected eerily against the snow-covered ground, creating what he described as a quote, Christmas-like scene, but one devoid of warmth, cheer, or joy. There were no bells, only the roar of artillery, the thud of bombs, and the chatter of rifle fire," Schwartz wrote. The front lines were far removed from the traditions and comforts of home. Even the soldiers' Christmas packages, delivered just before the battle, felt hollow in the face of their grim reality. It was white along the front on December 25th, but to us, it wasn't Christmas. It couldn't have been, Schwartz wrote. As the men struggled to make sense of their experiences, the war pressed on without pause. Schwartz described the surreal mix of battle and holiday traditions. Troops received turkey and chicken where battle lulls permitted, and the food was prepared in field kitchens set up in houses and even in schools in the towns and villages. Yet for many on the front lines, the days offered no respite. Many men failed to taste anything but the usual sea ration meal, hash or stew. The start of the new year brought no relief to these soldiers. New Year's Eve was observed strictly in warfare manner. There were no church bells, no plant whistles, no fire sirens, and no songs to greet the new and victorious year, Schwartz wrote. Instead, the sounds of war, rifle shots, artillery, and bombs marked the passage of time. On January 1st, 1945, Schwartz recalled how a rare hot meal arrived, brought in the same ammunition boxes used to supply the front. Late in the afternoon, turkey was brought to us in ammunition boxes, boxes which 1 hour before and 1 hour later were used to transport ammo to us, and we in turn sent it toward the Krauts. It was New Year's Day, but just another day to us, another day of war and another day of work. The psychological toll of battle was immense. Even amid victory, Schwartz and his comrades struggled to reconcile the horrors they had witnessed with their roles as soldiers. There was little peace these days for soldiers on the Western Front, he concluded somberly. Dom Buchenbach and its defenders had held firm, repelling the German assault and contributing significantly to the larger Allied effort to turn the tide in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge ended in an American victory more than 1 month later, in January 1945. The last great Nazi counteroffensive of the Second World War ended in total failure for Hitler's forces. They lost more than 100,000 casualties in their failed effort to split the Allied forces on the Western Front. In their victory, American forces suffered 80,000 casualties. Following the victory in Belgium, Allied forces amassed and prepared for their final assault over the Rhine River and into the heart of Nazi Germany itself. Irvin Schwartz and his comrades made significant, if often overshadowed, contributions to American victory in Belgium in December 1944. The 26th Infantry Regiment and the neighboring units blocked German forces from achieving their objectives and ultimately held firm around the village of Dom Buchenbach. For Irvin Schwartz, the Battle of Dom Buchenbach proved a life-altering experience, more so than even his experiences at Normandy on D-Day and in the fortress city of Aachen. His letters home from the front lines for the remainder of his service take on a darker tone, one that reveals an altered personality forged on the front lines and at the end of a 57mm anti-tank gun firing at point-blank range against colossal German panzers. In the days after the death of Staff Sergeant Noah Collier, the 20-year-old Irvin Schwartz took his place as Staff Sergeant in charge of the gun. The 26th Infantry Regiment and the U.S. Army's 1st Division fought their way into Germany in February 1945. Sergeant Irvin Schwartz fell wounded in fighting near Roth, Germany, on February 27, 1945, and received a Purple Heart for his wounds. He returned to his unit before war's end. For their service at Dom Buchenbach and turning back the German assault, Staff Sergeant Noah Collier was posthumously awarded the Silver Star. Staff Sergeant Irvin Schwartz was later awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his role in the day's events. His hometown newspaper and former employer, the West Schuylkill Press Herald, published the circumstances of Schwartz's receipt of the medal. The newspaper staff's pride practically beams off the page in this story. It reads, Staff Sergeant Schwartz gets DSC medal, Army's second highest award. The United States Army's second highest award, the Distinguished Service Cross, has been awarded to Staff Sergeant Irvin R. Schwartz, son of Mr. and Mrs. John A. Schwartz of Pleasant Valley. The young hero is a former reporter for the Press Herald. Only the Congressional Medal of Honor outranks the Distinguished Service Cross. The medal was pinned on Sergeant Schwartz by Major General Andrews, commander of the 1st Infantry Division, in the presence of hundreds of war correspondents, photographers, Army officers, and enlisted men, and a dinner in his honor was given later in the day by his company and regimental officers. The dinner was attended also by United States war photographer Bill Kruger of New York City. Sergeant Schwartz received the coveted DSC for extraordinary heroism in action against the enemy on December 21, 1944 in Belgium. When Major General Andrews pinned the medal on his tunic, he said, "Sergeant Schwartz, this is a mighty fine thing. You know, it's brave men like you that have put the Germans where they are and have licked the best that they could show us. And you know that at that time it was a hell of a lot. It's men like you that make me feel extra proud of my own division of men, and I feel proud to have the opportunity of pinning this highly distinguished medal on you." The citation accompanying the award reads as follows: Staff Sergeant Irvin R. Schwartz, then Corporal, 3362461, 26th Infantry, United States Army, for extraordinary heroism in action against the enemy on 21 December 1944 in Belgium, as his anti-tank gun position was fired upon by advancing hostile infantrymen. Staff Sergeant Schwartz fired his rifle and killed 3 Germans at close range. Unable to effect a penetration, the enemy summoned 4 tanks, which leveled intense cannon and machine gun fire upon him. Staff Sergeant Schwartz fired his anti-tank gun at the lead vehicle, setting it ablaze. As the remaining tanks and foot soldiers pushed forward, he knocked out the second tank less than 10 yards away. A shell from another tank destroyed his weapon, but Staff Sergeant Schwartz organized his remaining crew members as riflemen and assisted in repelling the enemy thrust. Signed, Courtney H. Hodges, Lieutenant General, U.S. Army Commandant. In writing to his parents about receiving the DSC, Schwartz said he was taken by complete surprise when he was ordered to leave the front lines and return to headquarters to receive the award. He said that in the action for which he was cited, he felt he was only doing his duty, and of course, in the heat of battle, was oblivious to the dangers to which he exposed himself. But when the encounter was over and the results taken in, there was jubilation and celebration in his quarters. He said he believes his picture was taken 1,000,000 times and that he was congratulated by someone from every state in the United States, from privates in the Army to top-ranking generals. The original citation certificate was received by mail by his parents. Sergeant Schwartz is a graduate of Pine Grove High School, class of 1942. He entered the Army on May 7th, 1943, was trained at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and went overseas in November 1943. Prior to entering the service, he was employed by the Fox Knapp Manufacturing Company. He has 2 brothers, Donald and Curtis, at home, both still attending school. An avid student of history and geography, he has availed himself of every opportunity since his arrival on foreign soil to visit as many places of interest in England, France, Holland, and Germany. On Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, on May 8, 1945, Schwartz penned a letter home to the West Schuylkill Press Herald to describe his thoughts. His mind wasn't in a celebratory place. Instead, it remained focused on his friends and comrades, like Sergeant Noah Collier of Norton, Virginia, who never lived to see a world at peace once more. Schwartz movingly wrote, "It's a nice, warm, sunny morning on Victory in Europe Day. All is quiet as I stand here looking over miles and miles of some of this country's richest farmlands and finest timber groves. I'm looking over ground which such a short time ago was our battlefield, a field stained with blood, ours and theirs. One would think that victory would mean noises of all sorts to the men who were in the fighting themselves, but this wasn't so. Very few bottles of liquor can be had, and on the whole, this great historic day is quiet among the very men who fought the war and lived safely through shells, bombs, snow, rain, and cold to bring peace to millions upon millions just a few minutes ago. Your minds may be focused on the boys returning home safely, but ours are and always will be with the men, thousands and thousands of them, who fell right beside us all through France, Belgium, and Germany. American troops are thinking of the friends left in the 1st Division graveyards of North Africa, Tunisia, Sicily, France, Belgium, and Germany, and there is very little, if any, joy-making here as a celebration of the war's end. They say they will celebrate later, probably in America. While the majority of us will take a boat ride, either to the Pacific or to America, many will remain here as an army of occupation in order to prevent another struggle, probably World War III. Regardless where we go or what we do, our thoughts and daily prayers will be with our comrades in the Pacific. By actual experience, we have found what war is to the guy in the foxhole. Schwartz spent the summer of 1945 in Czechoslovakia and occupied Germany. He returned home to Pine Grove, Pennsylvania in the autumn of 1945 for the first time in 2 years. He returned to write at the West Schuylkill Press Herald, penning local sports columns about his beloved Pine Grove High School. He took a job at the Bethlehem steel plant in the nearby city of Lebanon before taking on a job as the Pine Grove representative for the West Schuylkill Press Herald, managing advertising, deliveries, and gathering local news. His full-time career in journalism began. On May 9th, 1947, he married Dorothy Wirtz at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in the village of Ravine, Pennsylvania, just outside Pine Grove. Schwartz's colleagues at the Press Herald shared details of the wedding. They wrote, "The double ring ceremony was performed by candlelight at 7:30 by the Reverend M.M. Kipps before the altar that was beautifully decorated with white dogwood blossoms and evergreens. Mrs. Harvey Langle played the traditional wedding marches and other selections for the ceremony. Ira Shucker, soloist, sang Because and I Love You Truly." In 1950, Schwartz took a job at the Lebanon Daily News in the nearby city of Lebanon. He would work there for more than 35 years as a copy editor. Irvin Schwartz passed away in 1992, the age of 68. One of his many friends, Earl Schoenberger, penned a poem in the wake of Schwartz's death in which he lauded his friend, who he nicknamed the most noble oak. We watched another great oak fall. Irvin Schwartz was laid to rest. He may have been the tallest of all, to me, the noblest. He never paraded his intelligence, no great cause, no philosophy, but by any mortal measurement, he excelled in decency. Each town, each generation should have its Blackie Schwartz, the all-American, the eternal boy, loving people, events, and sports. He was driven to be a reporter, even in his high school days. Each week, he filled the Herald with statistics, scores, and praise. We worked together in 42 in the old Fox factory. I saw him in righteous combat before he joined the infantry. He was a twice wounded veteran, which I never heard him mention, and worked all his life for his 1st Division's national convention. He never lost his boyish smile, his shy wave and salutation, and his spoken touch of gentle Dutch enhanced his conversation. He remembered old local athletes and forgotten local games. He praised long departed decent folks, their works, deeds, and names. I never knew a nicer man. What greater honor can there be? And I've yet to meet a single soul who doesn't agree with me. He met the challenge of Kipling's if, as well as any mortal could, yet he lived in Foss's house by the road, gentle and kind and good. I never had the chance to meet Irvin Schwartz. He passed away 4 months before I was born. Yet through his wartime letters, I connected with this young man, a storyteller at heart with endless curiosity about the world. He faced death and destruction amid the world's bloodiest conflict with courage and tenacity. I am incredibly thankful to the Schwartz family, Irvin and Dorothy's 3 wonderful children, Sharon, Penny, and Donald, and their families, who have shared photographs, stories, memories, and more that have helped me gain a better understanding of this decorated military veteran, a humble man who, like so many of his generation, seldom spoke about his wartime service except among comrades of his beloved 1st Division. And I encourage you to read his letters yourself. See the Second World War through the eyes of a budding young journalist and soldier who survived Omaha Beach and the Battle of the Bulge, and who emerged a quiet, confident combat leader. You can find those letters by hitting the link in the show notes or by visiting winninghistory.com. Thank you so much for listening to this special episode of Public History with Jake and Justin. If you've been enjoying the show, make sure to subscribe and rate the podcast. We'll talk to you again soon.